This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Always have to wait for that message. So, hi everyone. I'm so excited that you're here, and I am really excited to kind of share my background and this area with all of you. So, first thing that I'm going to do is I'm also going to put up a QR code of the Minty as well, so you can participate. I find that this is, there will be some prompts for the chat, but there will also be some prompts that are a little, more private, I guess, or maybe you want to answer confidentially. So I wanted to give that option as well. So, with that, let me get dealing with like 14 million screens is what it feels like. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself first. I think it's really important to know why I do this work, where I'm coming from, so that you know that what I'm sharing is not just made up, but actually is based in research and frameworks that I've developed over time. So, first and foremost, I have over 10 years of experience in prevention education. I came to this field very intentionally. Prior to working there, I was actually a manager for Starbucks. Um, and so bring the level of leadership and management, which actually benefits quite a bit in the field. But I grew up in a household of domestic violence, and for me, it was really important to give back in some way. And one of the things that I tried doing was being an advocate, and really found quickly through volunteering as an advocate that I had not dealt with childhood trauma, and I had not really, or I didn't really have the resiliency band that advocates have, and still to this day I don't, right? Like I will sit with a student, I will make sure they get to all of the resources that they need. But whereas, a lot of advocates can turn around and take another call or take another client, I am done for the day. Um, I peace out, and that's the way it is, right? And so I very intentionally chose prevention education because I wanted to be involved, but I wanted to make it so that people didn't grow up the same way that I did or didn't experience sexual assault and dating violence through their college experience. So that is my background in the field. My Bachelor of Arts is in theater. So if anyone wants to nerd out with me, by all means, let's find some time and do it. And then I started a theater company with some colleagues, and it was really focused on looking at power dynamics and gender and really feminist theater practices, which I actually still bring into artistic work that I do. My master's degree is in gender, media, and culture, and I studied at the Gender Institute at the London School of Economics, and focused specifically in on masculinity studies. And I got a lot of pushback actually. So, a lot of people in my cohort, there were about 80 of us total, really didn't understand why I wanted to center men in the focus when I was doing violence prevention work. And part of the reason was I just got really sick of hearing you need men to get men involved in this work. And so I wanted to have a theoretical foundation of how do I do this? How do I get men involved when I'm the only one there to do so? So that was a lot of the reason for my focus in masculinity studies. And then, really deep down, I am a community organizer. I am also, I have read like I think I'm I think I'm at 3 books a week for this year. And so, so I read too much. So over 150 books for sure. Um, I bake. It is a way of me keeping my mom and what we did when I was growing up alive in my everyday. I am a dedicated friend, partner, and I say dog colleague because I feel like dog owner always sounds really weird. I don't like the idea of owning something. So I say that I'm a dog colleague because they also are not my children. And then I am just awkward and hopeful. So you will see those two pieces throughout this whole presentation. So just be mindful of that. But ultimately, I do this work for my family and I do it for my community as well. So why do I have this focus though? So first, I, was working at a private liberal arts school in rural Nebraska back in 2017. And, I noticed first and foremost that young men were using a lot of protection language when they were talking about violence prevention. And so one of the things that I started to think about is, how are we replicating that protectionist language in our work? Because what protection-based language in violence prevention does is it still positions one gender over the others, right? And so I found that that was kind of rubbing me the wrong way. And I wanted to do some analysis around, what might we, where are we seeing this really publicly? And so I discovered around that time the Man Enough show. Now, this is pre the Man Enough podcast, but the Man Enough show, it was like 8 episodes. It was Wayfarer and Harry's Razors, and it was Justin Baldoni after his like Man Enough TED Talk, where he was bringing together groups of men and really kind of redefining what masculinity could be and could look like. Now, the problem with that is when you have power, right? Masculinity is a power structure. When you have power redefining itself, ultimately it's just redefining what its power looks like. And so this is how you end up with Justin Baldoni also being accused, and credibly so, by actresses on the set of It Ends With Us for sexual harassment, but not only for sexual harassment, but also because we allowed his brand to be the good guy, the good masculinity. He was able to then manufacture an attack on anyone who would try to subject him to something different, right? So what we end up with is we end up seeing a man who has claimed to be an ally, has used the language of allyship and the language of healthy masculinity, has created a show and a podcast where typically men are sitting around redefining what that looks like without really a consideration for the relational aspects with other genders or the power that is inherent in how we perform masculinity. So we have all of that, and then it turns out that in private, and not necessarily in private because it was public, they were public sets, right? Um, he is doing things that are actually harming, right? So I started thinking about that. I did a critical reading of the show. They also had a sociologist who's well known on talking about masculinity issues, but that is a professor who's been credibly accused of dead naming and misgendering, as well as other accusations of harm. So, with that, understanding all of that, and then looking at, the rates of violence are not budging, right? And we've been doing a lot of the same things, and specifically a lot of the same things when it comes to working with young men. And so, with that, and adding to growing up watching those harmful masculine norms in action and hearing some of the things that I did in Nebraska, I really wanted to dig into what all of this can mean, right? So, with that, we're going to do our first poll. And forgive me. There we go. So, how comfortable are those of you participating speaking about masculinity, right? I think it's something that has become a regular part of our jobs, but I think it's also important to recognize when we're not necessarily comfortable doing it, especially in spaces where we've been asked to bring other people in to do it in our stead, right? All right. Oh, I love that though. I'm happy we don't have anyone that runs in the other direction because that makes me sad. So then our next question, how comfortable are you speaking with college-aged men about violence preventee? Apparently, I edited that and missed the last part of the word. So again, very somewhat, I love this. Okay. Fantastic. And then what men's engagement programs do you currently use? So none specifically, men engage our program at about a third the rate of female. Yeah, I mean, that's really common, right? Third the rate of female identifying students. Currently don't have any specific programs, provide counseling and advocacy for survivors, some fraternity work, don't have specific men's engagement programs, but we do programming with fraternities or men's out. Yeah, and that's very common, right? Our men and masculinity program was dissolved this year, and I'm guessing that you are probably in a state where you're not allowed to do that anymore. So that, oof. That hurts my heart because it goes beyond just violence prevention. It actually, like, we can talk about the intersection of masculinity and risk taking when it comes to substance use disorders. We can talk about masculinity and identity, something that I've noticed through my time with students and particularly student athletes is the way in which we frame it, right? Like we will talk about female student athletes as like, oh, they play basketball, right? It's something that they do. But with male student athletes, they're a basketball player. It's their identity. And so doing masculinity work is also not just about violence prevention, but it's also about identity and understanding who you are and how you engage in community with others. And so I think it's really important to recognize like that's not just the purpose. It's a it's a great purpose, but we can also link it to things like retention, right? If a student is, their full identity is the sport that they play, what happens when they're injured? Typically, our male student athletes leave, whereas our female student athletes are like, okay, well, I'll, focus in on my studies now. Now, do I have quantitative evidence about that? No, that's just my experience. But talking to a lot of athletics directors and a lot of people who work in athletics and work in wellness with athletics, it is a trend that they see as well. So maybe somebody will do a study on that someday. Probably not me. So we're going to return back to uh, our, presentation now that we kind of have an idea of who's here doing what, right? So I want to introduce, I did this in terms of framing it as a fraternity or as two fraternities because I think that's a natural touchstone for the bulk of us. So the first fraternity I want to introduce is Group A. Now, did I consider saying alpha, alpha, alpha and beta, beta, beta? Yes, I did. However, probably shouldn't play into that language a little bit when it comes to masculinity. So we're going to talk group A. Now, group A, honestly, this is the type of group that I love to work with because they are honest about who they are. There are public accusations about them. They are the group that, generally is called the bad boys or that boys will be boys, right? There's that approach to them. And to administrators and students, they are known as the problem on campus, right? But on the flip side of that, they are attempting accountability at kind of the community level, but also trying to hold each other accountable. And they're growing through that, right? They're not perfect, but they are openly trying to be better. And this is kind of an amalgamation of, I would say, three groups that I worked with or that I've worked with across different campuses. So this is not one single organization, but what I've discovered in my time working with fraternities. Now, Group B, on the other hand, tends to be known as the example organization, right? They, to the administrators, and notice that I say administrators and not students. They are known as the example to the administrators. They are applauded for their goals to protect women on campus, right? And they are also the group where students are afraid to report them when something does happen because they're worried that they're not going to be believed. They're worried that they are going to be targeted by other brothers in the organization. And they are worried that their credibility will be questioned because of the reputation of Group B. And so, as a confidential support, not at my current campus, but at other previous campuses, I can say I had a number of students come to me about these groups, about Group Bs, who had no interest in going through the administrative process specifically because of how the administrators viewed Group Bs. So I want to frame it through that, right? So we're looking at how do students engage with each other on campus. So I have a couple more poll questions, and I want to know, what have you met these groups, right? Yeah, some have, some haven't, right? Um, I would say they're probably a little more common than you might realize, right? And then how have you engaged with them? If you've engaged with them, you don't have to, right? Working on building connections through campus, including with FSL, athletics, well-being, masculinity specific program that's just starting. I love that. Love that. And hopefully there's something in here you can take away from that. Outreach and educational workshops, not me personally, but our organization has. Yeah. Yeah, they're there, right? And we'll talk a little bit about why. Um, how have these worked? They were okay, right? Um, and how do you know? There's always more work to do, and high turnover in staff create the need to continue to rebuild collaboration. Yeah, that I would say is probably something that people are seeing at every single one of their institutions. I was talking earlier about, I'm scheduling with fraternity and sorority life right now for a yearly training. And I'm doing the scheduling because right now we don't have coordinators. We're supposed to have two coordinators over our groups and we don't have them. And so that gap is causing difficulty in terms of what our scheduling looks like, how we're reaching out, things like that. And so part of that is because higher education does not pay well, right? And so how do you get people, especially in like spaces where it's very expensive to live, how do you get people to stay in positions that are not paying them what they need to survive in that space? Messaging lands with students, hard to scale up. Yeah, yeah. Anecdotally, seeing changes in the way members engage with one another and other chapters. Love that. Surveys after. We love a survey. We love a survey to see how things land. So, what might make you more successful? Oh, yeah, we'll hope. Fingers crossed that you will walk away with new ideas or at least a new connection because this is a topic I can absolutely nerd out about on a regular basis. So, by all means, you'll get my email at the end. Feel free to reach out. So, we're going to go back to, what is the current landscape? What are the current practices and what are some of the shortcomings? Now, this is not me attacking individual programs that exist out there, right? I want to be really clear, but I also want to recognize that there are programs specifically at the national level that have existed for a relatively long time. The last evidence-based, report about them tends to come out like 10 years ago, right? So we're not seeing adjustments to the world that we're living in, right? And so it's really important that we are evidence informed in the work that we're doing and we're meeting students where they are now, even if the program was evidence-based and had a high efficacy 10 years ago, right? So the first thing is looking at who is doing the work, right? So men's engagement work tends to be organizations fronted by men. And that is where we get the you need men to be able to get men involved kind of comment, right? Which, when you look at the breakdown from the Raft Advocate Wellness Survey, which, it was a small-ish sample size, but just from looking around at the conference as well as, engaging with our coworkers, we know that this is majority women in this field, right? So RAFT did the Advocate Wellness Survey. RAFT is the Resilience for Advocates Through Foundational Training organization, and they found that women were 91% of the field, and non-binary and genderqueer people were 4%, and men were 5%. So we are being told that 5% of people in the field are now responsible for 50% of the population, right? And so beyond that, you need men to get men involved. Rarely are we given the strategies to actually do that. And then, not to mention that, but if we, like the Man Enough show, right? If we are redefining what masculine power looks like, without regard to other gender identities, we are essentially just redefining what power over looks like, because that is what power over does, right? And so if we're doing that, we end up seeing things like this positioning as a means to protect, or positioning as, not a respect for all, but a kind of chivalrous respect for women, right? Which again feeds into an unequal power structure, and it fully erases anyone who doesn't sit within the gender binary. So that is kind of the first issue, I guess, is who is doing the work when our field is mostly women. And then the second one is who is the focus of the work? Now, we have a lot of programs focused on athletics, and we have a lot of programs that are focused on fraternities. And I'm not saying that those are not places that we need to be. But when we focus on that, who is missing? And go ahead and put in the chat, like, who's missing if we're only focused on athletes and fraternities? I'm going to try to look at the chat while we do that. Marching band, performing arts, nerd subcultures, right? And we know that nerd subcultures tend to exist online, right? And so a lot of the difficulty that we're seeing because of online spaces infiltrating into our everyday, we also need to be capturing, right? People who are looking for community. So we have, I really loved the framing yesterday of the isolation rather than loneliness crisis, right? And so we have students who maybe are already feeling isolated and want community, and we are not reaching them because we're focused on the students who already have community, right? And lots of differences between fraternities. One thing that I tend to do with my fraternity work is I actually really try to make sure that I base the work that I'm doing with them from their values so that it feels relevant to them, right? And it's based on something that they've already agreed this is how we live our lives. And so you're just adding to what that description and definition is and how they live that out, as opposed to trying to kind of put your own work on top of what they already have dedicated their lives to. So one of the one of one of the activities that I haven't done a lot, I've only done like once or twice, but I actually really love is having people write their own obituary in the first session. And the reason I do this, I know it's very dark, right? But I want people to think about how do I want people to talk about me when I'm no longer here? And am I living to that right now? Could I honestly say, this is who I am, and these are the values that I espouse? And if not, how can we make shifts and changes? What does it look like to live to those values? So, really rooting it in who they want to be, not who they're performing as, right? And it's kind of a personal activity with some broader discussion around the values, right? So that is one activity that I do that I want to measure more before I say one way or the other, but the immediate feedback that I've received is that it is kind of eye-opening, right? So the next issue is benevolent sexism. So Soraya Chemaly, she wrote a book, gosh, it was in the late 2010s, I think. Rage Becomes Her, The Power of Women's Anger. And in an interview about the book, she describes benevolent sexism in this way. So, benevolent sexism, also sometimes referred to as ambivalent sexism, is not hostile. It's not, as you described, a hatred of women. As a matter of fact, it's often the opposite. It seems very caring, very paternalistic, very protective. That doesn't mean, however, that it doesn't reflect prejudices. That distinction between a hostile sexism and a warmer, fuzzier sexism is important because very often the insidious quality of sexism comes out of this idea that this is good for you, that the person who is enacting this sexism is caring for you. So you can see how that is a part of our group B approach to life, right? They are protecting, they are caring for. One of the groups that I worked with had during Rush, one of the events was a dance, and they would circle around the women who were dancing and try to protect those women from other groups. Now, I've been out dancing with good friends. I get that instinct. There are times where you just don't want anyone to come up and start dancing with you just because they think they can, right? But they were keeping other men from engaging in any way whatsoever. So there was this really unhelpful and harmful masculinity and this masculine identity to protect as opposed to creating a scenario where women are allowed to choose for themselves. We just keep them separated, right? Again, it's contributing to that less than. So when we talk again about benevolent sexism, right, we're really talking about the insidiousness of it. It's difficult for people to identify. It's difficult for people to call out. And oftentimes it parades as helpful. So, for example, this this was prior to me going to grad school. I grew up in Southern Oregon. If anyone is from Oregon, you know that there are issues in Southern Oregon. I tend to refer to Southern Oregon as the deep south of the Great Northwest if we were talking in terms of stereotypes. And so that's kind of the situation in which I grew up. And one day I was visiting my mom, and my sister and I were in the car. We were in the Costco parking lot. It was around the holidays. And this guy, like, stopped his car and very irritatedly, at least from my point of view, helped my mom back out of her spot. And I made a comment that, like, she didn't need his help. Like, he clearly was not wanting to, right? It was coming from a space of, like, this woman doesn't know how to drive. And so I need to stop my car and support her because he wasn't waiting for the spot. We got out and he followed us, right? So it wasn't that he needed anything, he was just helping. But in that helping, he was identifying that a car full of women isn't good at driving, right? And I said something to that effect, and my sister was so angry with me. And she was like, he was just helping. And it's true, right? On the surface. But when you start to scratch away at that surface, he was helping because he believed that women were worse at something and couldn't do something without his support. And that's what I mean by it being difficult to call out because I said something about it, and even my sister argued with me about it. Now, looking back on it, we brought it up. She and I were talking about it a few weeks ago, even, and she was like, yeah, I see what you were saying now. But I still think this, right? So we're getting there. But when it's difficult to call out, it's difficult for everyone to call out. It may make you feel uncomfortable, but not necessarily have the language why. So that's the first piece of benevolent sexism being so prevalent and part of the problem is it's insidious. It kind of goes under the radar. And back to our group B, right? It's all of those cases that never came to be, but were all incidents that came out of that organization. On the surface, they were protecting women, when in actuality, they were harming their peers. And there was also a level of compulsory heterosexuality in that organization, right? And so not only were they harming their female identified peers, but they were also harming queer peers in that space as well. And because of the requirement to be heterosexual in that group, um, it caused feelings of shame and inadequacy and inability to come forward and talk about what happened with their organization or what another brother did to them. So again, that insidiousness. It's also reinforced, right? The language we use in the movement, right? How we are often situating gender exclusive groups, right? And that's not to say that that's always wrong, because it's not. But again, back to that piece of when we are talking about masculinity, are we letting people redefine what that power looks like without any regard to how other genders might interact with that? And then also with who we allow to do the work, right? If men need to be involved to get men involved, what does that say about women who are the leaders in the field? It's almost discrediting at a certain point. if they're unable to speak to half the population because we've created these rules. So that's kind of this field focused, right? But societally, we're also seeing, right, the rise of trad wives, and situating that in a way where we're putting, mothers against people who are child free. We are placing women back in the home, which makes things like domestic violence, which makes things like sexual violence become a private issue again. If women don't have a public life, then we also don't have public access to a better life, right? And then there's also attacks on autonomy. So that can be through like the rise of your body, my choice language that happened online right after the election last year. It's also reproductive justice, right? When we talk about reproductive justice, it is the ability to raise a family in a safe community, right? It's not just about having abortion access. Reproductive justice is economic justice, it is racial justice, right? It has all of these components to it. And so when we attack autonomy at fundamental levels, we're also attacking all of that. And then we also see an increased security state, right? And it's always framed as protection for women. So when we look at the landscape of trans bathroom bills, right, that is framed as a protection for women. However, when you think about it, who is more likely, right, to be asked to prove, right? We're normalizing that it's okay to have to prove that you are a cis woman. It's also erasing people, trans and non-binary people, from public life. So it's working on a number of levels. But then we also look at something like the Riley-Gaines Act, which is villainizing immigrants as a protection for women, particularly white women. It's always white women, let's be honest. And so, again, societally, we see these structures in place of benevolent sexism that is really targeted at encouraging an order in which women are less than and trans and non-binary people don't exist, right? That's the goal. And so when we use that protectionism language, it's just reinforcing this, right? So I want to take a minute. I'm going to catch up in the chat if there's been anything, but I want to do a quick check-in because we've had, those are kind of the overarching issues, if you will, drawbacks of what we're currently doing, the state of our current work. So I want you to kind of notice, how are you feeling right now? Has this been your experience? What is, and you don't have to put anything into the chat, but what are what are you feeling? And take about 30 seconds. And I'm going to stop talking during that 30 seconds. And then I'm going to take another 30 seconds and think through some things to celebrate. I think for me, it's really important when we are trying to approach such large topics. It's incredibly important for me to ensure that I'm celebrating the things that I'm doing right, even if they're not perfect. And even if, maybe there isn't qualitative or quantitative data that can back it up at the moment. What am I doing that I can celebrate? What is my team doing that I can help them celebrate? And then setting intentions. So I'm going to introduce a new framework and moving into that, what's one thing you want to focus on? Oh, Nola, I love this. It's so wonderful when it goes right, right? Um, and so often it can be hard, especially with some of the groups that we work with, especially with some of the language we use, right? You'll notice at no point do I use the term toxic masculinity. I tend not to use healthy masculinity either. But I actually talk about masculine norms and just frame it that way because I find that it is easier to discuss cultural norms rather than individual traits, which I think toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity make people feel like we're talking about individual traits. And so that is some of the language that I use and in this framework as well. That is some of the language that I tend to bring into that work. So a more inclusive approach to this. Now, I'm going to be real with y'all. I quoted myself. So just let me be like academic and nerdy for a second with my quote from my dissertation. So, how I defined masculinity in my theoretical framework for the work that I did, looking at constructions of media or constructions of masculinity in the media after a mass shooting. So, that's kind of the broad scope of what I was writing about. But I wrote about masculinity being a dialectical conversation between structure, so gender as done to us. So, what is the policing that we are dealing with? What are the things that we learn? What are the expectations, the norms, and agency, gender as done by us? So, these are always going to flex and move together where one has more leeway, the other will push, right? So it's embodied subjects, right? I think it's really important to remember that gender is at the site of the body. So embodied subjects reproduce gendered expectations that have been normalized through years of reproduction and policing self and others' behavior, all within the space to resist, redefine, or choose situationally specific behavior. So when we talk about being able to resist and redefine and choose specific behavior, that's really the crux of the framework that I'm going to introduce, right? So we're looking at patterns, right? We're looking at where gender occurs. We're looking at the practices, what of gender. And then we're also looking at the effects. How does it impact the community and the people we're working with? All right. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. So When we talk about broadening the scope, so one of the things that was really important to me is that we tend to leave out a lot of people when we're talking about masculinity. And oftentimes it's because we are really only focusing on those particular groups, right? Athletes and fraternities. And so for me, if gender is a social construct, which most of us in this field believe, then we have to address it as a social construct, right? We have to address it from society, not just from individual groups and asking individual men to uphold or deconstruct, right? So we have to address all of the groups that uphold the standards of the gender binary, which can be really uncomfortable, right? Because I know growing up, I upheld those. I know that there are uh, friends that I have who, grew up socialized as men and are now trans women, and they still hold some of that normalized behavior, right? Same thing with people who are now transmasculine, right? Because they are trying to meet that standard, right? So it's really important that we recognize that it's not just cis men upholding this. And that's complicated and it's messy and it feels gross, right? Because it can very easily we can take that and say like, oh, then they're at fault, right? They're upholding these standards, so it's their fault that we feel this way. And that's not at all what I'm saying. But if gender is a social construct, then we're all responsible for deconstructing that and for upholding harmful masculine norms. So we sit with that. It's complex. It feels weird. And then again, I want to make sure this is not a case against single gender spaces. I think those spaces can be incredibly important for helping people open up, for helping people understand, and for helping people, you know, talk about holding each other accountable. But we have to discuss, if we're redefining that it's okay for us to do this, right? Where, for example, like it's okay for men to cry now. That is a discussion as a society we are having. But our same society is also saying things like women are still too emotional to lead. Those are two sides of the same coin. We have to be able to have the conversation where, yes, you can show your emotions more than anger, but also so can other genders. So there has to be some level of relational aspect that is an equitable relational aspect, not placing masculinity above other genders. So that is the first thing, broadening that scope. So in the chat, I want you to put in like how might you work with group A and group B? So back to our fraternities, one who is, upholding some of those masculine norms that may be, dominant in our society, and group B, that more benevolent, sexist, insidious. How might you work with them to address relational aspects of gender? Navigate over to the chat and see what we have. And it's also okay if you need time to think. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next part, but feel free to put things in the chat. I will check in a second. So then the next piece is, understanding the power dynamics. So first, we're talking about broadening the scope to if it's a social construct, it needs to be a social solution. The second thing is understanding power dynamics. I don't know about all of you, but when I first started in this work, one of the things that constantly I had young men constantly coming into my office saying, I was accused of this. I don't know why. I swear I got consent. And there are parts of me that understood that because there is an implicit power structure that we are dealing with, as well as an explicit power structure that we are dealing with. And as a field, we tend to focus on the explicit power structure, which tends to be the more overt actions. But the implicit power structure is where things like privilege, or as I term it, systemic advantages, come in. Now, I say systemic advantages because I did a lot of DEI work in rural Nebraska, and I found that that was a much more approachable way of talking about privilege because you're talking about the advantages that the system provides rather than talking about individual privilege that maybe somebody grew up with. So immediately, people are more interested and open to the conversation. So with that, I wanted to think about how do we make the power dynamics visible? And so understanding power dynamics, when we talk about hegemonic masculinities, right, which, yeah, academic term, but really what we're talking about is that dominant power maintaining masculinity. And if you look at some of the, foundational work from R.W. Connell, she wrote a lot about masculinities. And the first iteration was hegemonic masculinity. But in a, revisiting of her foundational work, she really talked about hegemonic masculinities. So it's not just one type of masculinity, but rather multiple types that fit into the hegemonic structure, that hold power for masculinity. And the thing about hegemonic masculinity is it morphs and shifts so that it can maintain power. So, for example, it picks up little pieces of masculinity that's kind of bubbling to the top and it says, this is ours now. So the best, like most notable example I think I can give for this group is back in the days of metrosexuals, problematic term in and of itself, what that really was was hegemonic masculinities trying to take on certain characteristics, also known as just taking care of yourself, I guess, but trying to take on certain characteristics and make them part of its own power structure. So now it was okay to use moisturizer, to get a manicure. It was okay to care about how you looked and want to look your best. And it, if you look at the timing of it, it actually was pulling a lot of that from gay culture. So we had this forced heterosexuality, this compulsory heterosexuality required to be a part of the hegemon. And as we saw bubbling up of different identities, the hegemon took that and ate those little pieces and said, this is ours now. This is a part of our power. And you stay over there, right? Because it didn't actually change any acceptance of anyone. It just maintained its power. So we're still seeing that in a lot of ways. But often we're hiding that in our work, right? And so what that does is it allows the redefinition of what those permissions are. I talked about the crying piece, right? And my next chat question will allow you all to share where you've seen that. And then it also, interestingly, allows masculine power to be tapped into by many others to uphold these structures. So, for example, there are there are studies right now about our field and how our field actually tends to, and this is mostly in the nonprofit space and not in the college space, but the violence prevention intervention field tends to replicate harmful structures. And one of those structures is racism, and one of them is prioritizing of male voices, right? So we see how those structures can be tapped into even by the people who say that they're doing the anti-violence work. And so I also think of, you know, women who, when they get into leadership, tend to replicate some of those same harmful behaviors that we see men use in leadership. Because in our country, leadership has been defined for so long by men and the behaviors and norms of men. And so women, when they get to that leadership level, will tap into that power and those behaviors, right? It's aligning itself with the masculine power that exists. So that is why we need to understand the power dynamics in the work that we're doing, right? Is we recognize it's going to replicate itself, it's going to morph to maintain that power, and people are able to tap into that power. So, where have you seen this on your campus? If you have, just go ahead and drop that in the chat, and I'm going to switch over to see if we have anything. Again, it's okay if not. But I just want to make sure that you have an opportunity to share, what are you thinking about right now? What's coming up for you? I know this is different, and I am aware of that. So when we talk about making the visible or making visible the invisible, right? So if we're hiding power structures, then how do we actually make them visible? So because implicit power structures can cause harm if students don't understand how implicit power works. So this is where we as a field need to get better when it comes to doing identity-based work. Because back to our fraternities, group A may come across as more homophobic, whereas group B will say they're inclusive. But as I mentioned, because there wasn't, identity-based work, we weren't examining how identity and power work, group B caused more harm for their individuals who were part of the queer community versus group A, who maybe outrightly one or two of them said a slur, but they actually were able to police that for themselves. And that made them more focused on the accountability piece, right? So again, that's where we're seeing these implicit power structures. And then by making power dynamics explicit within our work, it also helps us with that identity and power, right? So it increases an understanding of the gender dynamics, but it also increases and supports the inclusion of race, gender identity, ability, sexual orientation, right? All of the identities that people can hold can actually exist in the work that we're doing with a recognition that not everyone is going to walk into a space with the same amount of power. Some identities are going to provide them that power, some identities are not. And it's important that they understand that that's how it exists. And additionally, making visible the invisible actually brings to the forefront who can be harmed, which is anyone, and who can cause harm, which is also anyone, right? So we all have the capacity to harm or be harmed. And I think that when we are bringing identities and power dynamics into our work in a more visible way, that becomes more explicit. And then it also, because we can address those other pieces and those other identities, it also questions and challenges compulsory heterosexuality as a masculine norm in a way that some of the other norms may not be challenged when we talk about these power dynamics. So, again, in the chat, how might group A and group B feel about discussing implicit and power dynamics? No. Oh, no, you don't want me to go on that soapbox, but you are absolutely correct. They align, right? And one of the things that I talk about, so if not everyone is in the chat, a little off topic, but I've been thinking about white femininity in our field leadership, and I think there's an overlap with, but different expressions of problematic masculine norms. Absolutely. And we also see when I talked about, we're maybe appropriating language, right? We see young men appropriating the anti-violence language. We also see white feminists appropriating anti-racist language and actually using that to cause additional harm. And so these are absolutely tied to one another. So not off topic at all. Let's see. Group A would probably be more open, a little more complicated with Group B because there hasn't been open recognition of their impact like with Group A. Absolutely, right? They are going to probably fall back on the norms. Well, we're this, and this is what we do, and this is why. And so being able to push and challenge in some of those spaces. So when we talk about sharing power, right, we want to shift social norms, but it has to be through collective action. It has to bring everyone together who upholds and reproduces the norms. And then accountability is embedded into the approach, right? So we're identifying the norm, we're shifting it, we're communicating what that shift is, and then we're reinforcing that, right? Not through policing, but rather through a more restorative approach, through accountability, through permissions, right? And continuing to communicate and then addressing pushback, right? But that takes all of us, which is why having, this relational aspect embedded and looking at the power dynamics embedded in our work actually allows us to move further faster. So, all of that, all of what we've discussed can be kind of distilled into this framework that I use. Now, I don't necessarily put this up on a slide and say, you are in this space, right? But rather, a different way of talking about masculinity that allows us to map this onto current approaches that we already have, right? It gives us different language to provide, but also different understandings of the whys, which I think for a really long time, young men have felt alienated from our work because the why was always rooted in you have all the privilege, stop. And that always felt like a personal attack, right? Which we have a lot to do as a society, but we have to understand that the guys we're working with probably that's not how they feel. They don't feel like they're on top of the world, right? And so when we talk about it in terms of toxic and healthy or unhealthy and healthy, we're not necessarily giving them the space to learn differently. we turn them off almost immediately. So you can use whatever words you want, right? But what it really boils down to is how well can they articulate why they act or believe the ways that they do. So when we talk about a rigid masculinity, this can also be reinforced, right? A reinforced masculinity. We're talking about a masculinity that conforms to the dominant norms, but does so without critical assessment, right? So it's only doing it because we've been told to do it, right? This is a masculinity that is rewarded for compliance, but it also is the most vocal masculinity in enforcing those norms with others. So that is where we see the most issues, right? That's where issues crop up. Negotiated masculinity, on the other hand, is kind of a cultural code switching, right? So this may be somebody who recognizes things, they want to do things differently, but also is responding to their own safety. So in certain spaces, they may act in a rigid way. In other spaces, they may act in an emergent way, right? But ultimately, they're alternating, and sometimes that alternating is subconscious and, well, often it's subconscious, but sometimes it's conscious, right? How am I safest in this space? So we're going to see that. But the fundamental there is that they understand what the norms are. They usually can articulate their reasoning for that alternating, but they also are still benefiting from that power, right? So really understanding that they know what they're doing for the most part. Can they maybe say exactly why? No, but they can say, well, in this space, I feel safer when I act like this, right? It's easier. I don't get pushback. It's not, this doesn't become a problem, right? So they can kind of articulate some of those things. And then an emergent masculinity, right? And you can say like an authentic masculinity, but I think that word has gotten a little too much use. So you can use emergent, and this is rooted in really understanding and assessing your own values. So whereas rigid is there's no questioning, I'm doing the thing that I'm told by dominant structures, and I'm doing it because I'm rewarded for it. And then I'm enforcing it with others, right? Emergent is I do this because it's authentically who I am, right? And that is the difference. Power is shared, it is decentralized, right? When we talk about sharing power, it's that collective action. We are a part of a collective. And then it's emergent is also more complex. It's a collaborative type of identity. It's building that community, and it can be really expansive. We just have to allow people to embrace it. It's authentic and adaptable, but not in the same way that a negotiated masculinity is going to move from side to side, right? It's reliant on the collective, and not just the collective who's involved, but the collective needs of the community. So that is the kind of crux of the work that I do with young men is how do I, one, identify where, the group might be in this space, individuals might be in this space, but how do we ultimately get to a space where they are questioning and thinking through the fundamentals of who they are as a person, and is that who they want to continue to be? In my lifetime, I have met some bro dudes, right? That, well, like they will always be. bro dudes. But it is authentically who they are. They are not performing masculinity at all. They are just legitimately that person. And so I think it's really important to leave space for them as well. All right. So wrapping up because I got a couple minutes. So ultimately, when it comes to our key points, we are falling short in meeting the moment, right? We haven't seen a reduction. We're seeing an increase in radicalization online, but we're also giving them that language to reproduce harm, just like white feminists co-opting language from the anti-racist movement to reproduce racialized harm, right? We are providing that language because we're giving language without a power analysis. And then the social constructs of gender mean a full society solution, right? We can't just focus on men to solve a masculinity issue. Recognizing and understanding the complexities of navigating the constructs needs to include power dynamics, making them visible, sharing power, so that collective action, that working together, and then also including that relational component, not as a protector, but how do we relate to equals? So at the end of the day, I want to make sure that everybody knows that this framework it's additive, right? It's not meant to substitute all the other programs that exist out there, but rather it's giving us some, language to use as the foundation of how we engage with men in our work. So there is one last poll, which should be open, which is what is one actionable item you can take from this session and try at your campus? I've given little tips here and there, but we'll see. But while you're answering that, I'm going to go ahead and stop share because I want to look at the chat. And see if there are any questions, anything that you want described a little further, and anything that I can, provide even more information on. Again, this is not a regular framework. It's something that is maybe new to a lot of people, but I want to make sure that it's something that can be useful to people in how they approach and build out curriculum for their campuses. I don't see anything. So I'm going to go ahead and assume that there aren't, but I'll stick around for a couple, like a minute or two, to see if anybody has any questions they want to ask individually. But I will also put my information in the chat if you do want to reach out. There you are.
Thank you so much, Susanna, and thank you everyone who joined us. We hope you can join us for our final